You cannot be a good manager if you cannot manage change and conflict well. Therefore, it is very important that you understand better how to manage change and also more about your own conflict management style so that you can deal with conflict better. But let's have a look a little bit at change first. I start off by just giving a few general introductory comments on change or some generic principles. The first one is that change creates at least some discomfort. Everybody or most people are at least comfortable, and some people it's very uncomfortable to be subjected or to deal with change. Then during change, we usually think about what we stand to lose. So the first thought that pops into our heads is, how is this going to affect me? Not positively, but negatively, what we stand to lose. And then also what usually happens during change is that people feel isolated, and they isolate themselves further. So people would go behind closed doors, they would share less, and they would be more in their own offices and not in the tea rooms. Then sharing and cooperation comes with difficulty or come with difficulty during periods of change. This point says that if change is not sustained enough for long enough, you will revert back to the original. And you will, many of us can testify to this point. If you've tried to lose weight, you lose weight, and 3 months down the line you've regained all that weight, so you revert back to the original. Another important generic principle is that we defend and protect what we have, so people become more defensive and more protective. And then lastly, we can get overloaded by doing too much too fast. So there is a threshold and also a pace at how fast we can implement change. A few more comments on change. When we say that people resist change or they're uncomfortable in dealing with change, it does not mean that people cannot change. We are simultaneously very adaptable, yet in general very resistant to change. And the main reason why we are adaptable, why we can change, is because we can think more than any other species. So we can problem solve to deal with cold and with heat and then also, of course, in the work circumstances, people can change. Then what I would just like to emphasize here, we can distinguish between incremental change and transformational change, and we're not talking about incremental changes here in particular. Incremental change is small changes, like little bit tweaks, maybe in an operational environment, a little bit less downtime, a little bit less waste, a little bit more efficiency. If you add it up, it's going to create some positive change. But what we're talking about here, the kind of change is transformational change, where there's a big difference between the beginning and how does it look after then the change. Managing change is often a project within a project. So you would be implementing, say, software, but while you are doing that, you have to also manage the people that have to use the software in the end. Then communication is critical during change, and change should be a managed process. Now in this slide we are showing how process can be managed through taking particular steps. Now these steps come from John Kotter at Harvard University, and they studied major corporations or major organizations that went through major changes, and they established if a company organization goes through certain steps and they complete each step well, then there's a greater chance that the change will be successfully implemented. And I suppose all of you have some example in the workplace where change was implemented and it was not successful. Now, if you look at these first 8 steps by John Kotter, you will notice that nothing has changed yet. So the first 4 steps are basically to prepare for change. So establishing a sense of urgency is to prepare that people, the basic principle there is if people don't feel a need to change, they won't change. The second step is you create a guiding coalition, so you put together a small group of people who will manage the change. Then only do you develop the full vision and the strategy of what is it that you get to at the end, and also the strategy of how to get there. Fourth step, you communicate the change so that there is clarity and people understand and they know what is coming and also how to do it. Only in the fifth step you start implementing the change, and when you start implementing, it's on a broad-based action. So you get rid of obstacles, you change the systems, you look at what's preventing the change, and it is broad-based. So it means you start with quite a big group or total organization when you start the big change or major transformational change process. The step number 6 is to generating wins. This is an important step so that to prevent the overload. So there are stages and phases, and at the end of this you look back and you say, okay, this is how far we've come. And you acknowledge that that's the short-term wins, and then you continue with more change. In step 7 and 8, those are the ones that where you really start anchoring the change or making it part of the culture. So you would produce more change and more, where it's on a system level, it's on a structural level, it's on a people management level, to really keep the momentum going. And eventually, when you do that for long enough, this new way of doing things will then be anchored in the culture or in the organization. So this is a process that you can then apply in the workplace. Think about each one of these steps and how you are going to do it if you have to manage and implement large-scale changes. And in this one slide, we are looking at managing conflict. Now, the first introductory comment on conflict is that change is a good thing in a group. Or we can say the absence of change can lead to disasters. There are many examples of which the Challenger space shuttle was one, where it was in the end contributed to groupthink. Which is really when there's a total absence of conflict, and that was one of the reasons why the Challenger exploded, and this was happened in the 18s. So it's a good thing because then it stimulates ideas. People don't just agree and take the first option for granted. They think about things, and if there are differences, usually if you work through these differences, you have a better outcome than where you initially started. Then the second comment we make here is that it's the responsibility of the project leader to manage conflict. If you cannot manage conflict well, you cannot be a good project manager or a good leader. Then you also looked at your personal or your management, your inventory styles, and that gives you an indication of how you would usually deal with conflict. And the best way of dealing with conflict is to confront and work through conflict rather than avoid or attack, but to work through conflict in a systematic way. What can further help you to deal with conflict better is not to only look at your own personal conflict management style, but also to look at the source of the conflict. And if you've identified the cause, then you can take a particular route to address that conflict. Now, here we mention here are 4 different sources of conflict. The first one is value differences. So that's when people have personal agendas or there are ideological differences in the workplace. The second source of conflict is factual disagreement. Parties differ on the basis of facts. Now you may ask, but how can people differ on a fact? Isn't a fact a fact? A fact is not a fact. We always interpret facts. For example, we can ask, what is the exchange rate? It's maybe 16.8 to the dollar, and then we ask, is that a good or a bad thing? And that would depend whether you import or export. So it depends on what perspective or what glasses you put on to look at the fact. So we always interpret facts, and therefore people can differ on not the fact, but how they interpret the fact. The personality clashes happens when two people really not get on, and as is, one must be careful not to contribute too many conflict situations to personality clashes, because that's a very difficult one to deal with. And it's sometimes when there's a history between two people and therefore they have this clash, but sometimes people just can't stand each other more for unconscious reasons than conscious reasons. The fourth source of conflict is plans differences. That's more looking at the future of how people should proceed into the future, and then they would disagree on how to go about it. Now, if you've established the source of the conflict, you can take a different route to address that particular source of conflict. The first one, value differences. The best way forward then would be to search for common ground, and there is always some common ground between people, even if you think there's no difference. So one would pause the conflict and say, okay, but what do we have in common? So what is the basis? What is the point of departure that we start from in working together? The second, if there's factual disagreement, the way to deal with it is in a non-personal, analytical, and factual basis. So you would compare, you would evaluate, you would work with the numbers, and in that process then you can come to an agreement, whereas initially there was the disagreement on the basis of the facts. Then personality clashes, it's usually one has to manage it because it's very difficult to resolve it. So you would try and create a better understanding and get the two people to compromise. If you don't manage that, then you would have to have a third party involved when these two particular individuals or then these two groups have together. So you would have somebody present that can facilitate that phase of the project for them and with them. The fourth source of conflict is when there are plans differences. That's on the way forward. The way forward would be to first establish the criteria for evaluation, and then you evaluate the plan. So you pause the plan, you put it on hold or you park it. You say, but what criteria do we use to evaluate the plan? For example, do we look at say the capital gain, or do we look at the social contribution of a particular plan? And if you can agree then on how you would evaluate it, it would be much easier then to go back to the plan and say, okay, but do we have a good plan, or do we have to adapt the plan in order to fulfill the criteria or what we do want to accomplish with the plan? So these are the two areas that you have to manage as a project manager. The one is the change management, and the second one is conflict management.